Hello, my name is Darryl Robert Schoon, and the title of today's program is The End of the Beginning. And the reason for that particular title is because this show is being shot in December 2013. And exactly 7 years ago, in December 2006, I was finishing up my 148-page report called Time of the Vulture, How to Survive the Crisis and Prosper in the Process. This was a paper I was preparing to present to the Positive Deviant Network, a group formed by my friend from law school, Marshall Thurber, in 2005, where he brought together what he called a group of positive deviants. There were 60 of us, and I guess he described us as high-achieving or out-of-the-box thinkers. You could say positive deviants are those who just don't adhere to the path and see solutions that otherwise aren't seen by those in the mainstream. And that group that Marshall brought together certainly was indicative of what he called positive deviants. I had met a person, another positive deviant there the year before, 2005. His name was John Body. And John, I think he was probably 35 at the time, was rather an extraordinary person, certainly qualified as a positive deviant. After graduating from college, he had become a vice president at Kidder Peabody, and then ultimately a director at Deutsche Bank. And at the age of 32, in 2002, John and 10 others under his leadership, formed a hedge fund in London and New York called CLCM, Credit Lyonnais Credit Management, a proprietary multi-billion-dollar hedge fund that dealt in debt. And his management of this fund was so extraordinary that 3 years later he was named by Credit Magazine as one of the top 50 bond traders and inducted into the Bond Trading Hall of Fame. Interestingly enough, John's nickname in the business was Gentleman John. And they gave him that nickname because they said he valued long-term relationships over short-term gain. And if any of you know about Wall Street, this is not the way most traders comport themselves. I told my friend Marshall that bond trading was a blood sport for the bloodless. Nonetheless, John Body was given that nickname. He had already retired by the time 2.5 years later, he left CLCM and had made his mark in the world of finance. In fact, in 2002, he was asked to give a lecture at the Federal Reserve on European debt structures at the time. So the reason why I brought John's name up was Marshall knew that since the mid-1990s, I had been studying the Great Depression for some unknown reason. I mean, what was a former hippie doing reading about the Great Depression? But I was. And I was focused on it. And by the end of the 2000s, before the dot-com boom even collapsed, I was convinced we were headed for another Great Depression, even worse than the 1930s. And after the dot-com boom collapsed in March 2000, and NASDAQ, I think, lost 70% of its value in the next year. The Dow dropped 40%. S&P dropped what I think probably 60%. And the Federal Reserve slashed interest rates back down to 1%, trying to get their credit and debt bubble going again. And they succeeded to a certain degree. They set in motion a property bubble even bigger and more consequential than the stock bubble that they had created in the 1990s, and that was to blow up in 2007. But I'm ahead of myself. This was 2006, 2005 when I met John, when Marshall put the Positive Deviant Network together, and he introduced John to me as a person who had made a significant mark in Wall Street, bond trading, and he was also concerned about the economy. Now, very few were concerned about the economy at this time. John said he had talked to some of his friends about what he believed could happen Could happen. And they looked at him and they said, you know, John, if I had thought like this, I never would have made the money that I've made. And John knew it to be true. Nonetheless, he was concerned about the markets in 2005 when I met him. But I knew in my heart of hearts, John wasn't nearly as concerned as I was. I had heard words in 1991. They came to me and they said what was going to happen was a time it called the time of the vulture, when both the bulls and the bears would be buried beneath the rubble of economic collapse. And at the time, in 1991-92, there was no sign of any such collapse. But nonetheless, I started reading about what happened during the Great Depression on my own. My background was in political science, not economics. But I did have some real questions. What happened to the money? What happened during the 1930s exactly that brought basically the global economy to a halt? What was it that caused this great machine called capitalism to just collapse? And could it happen again? Well, I had reached the conclusion when the dot-com boom collapsed in 2000 that what we had seen was another replay of the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, when the stock market bubble, the radio phenomena, RCA that time, was a proxy for what was to happen later, the dot-com. Valuations just exploded. Speculation was running amok. And the collapse of the stock market in 1929 was basically reflected in the collapse of the tech markets in 2000. And I expected, again, we were headed for another Great Depression. Well, Greenspan slashed interest rates down to 1% in 2001, 2002. And in the next 3 years, the cheap money flowing into the markets, they loaned everybody. Clerks, people, they filled out forms to borrow money. They were called liar loans. Why were they called liar loans? Because the people who filled them out lied about their income. And, well, you could understand that, but what you really couldn't understand was why the bankers didn't read and catch them in their lies. The lies were blatant because they knew no one was checking. Now, why weren't the banks checking these liar loans and turning them away? Because the bankers weren't going to hold those loans in their own books. The bankers had set up the game where they were going to package these loans and sell them to unsuspecting buyers around the world. Pension funds, insurance companies, banks in Australia, private people, because they could offload these loans and not hold them and make money in the middle. This was done as an extreme measure to hopefully restart the bankers, what I now call the Ponzi scheme of credit and debt. But I knew when I came to the Positive Deviant Network, I may have been alone in my thoughts and feelings about what was going to happen, but who I was surrounded with were people like John Body. There were people of great wealth in the PDN, along with great achievement. And I couldn't just get up and say, you know, it's going to hell in a handbasket and get away with it. So what I did in 2006, I began writing down my thoughts. And by December in 2006, I had finished them. At that time, it was a 148-page paper that I knew I was going to deliver at the March meeting at the PDN in Utah. We met 4 times a year. So I delivered this paper in March to my fellow members, fellow positive deviants, and I told them what I believed was going to happen, and my 148-page paper backed up, to the best that I could, my assertions that we were going to have another deflationary collapse, such as happened during the 1930s, except this time it was going to be even worse. This time, the collapse was going to be accompanied by a monetary crisis. In the 1930s, you had a huge collapse in demand. caused by the speculative money that drove asset valuations through the roof. And when they collapsed, all you had left was debt. The banks couldn't cover it, and the banks went out of business. You had a deflationary collapse in demand, and basically the global economy had ground to a halt by the mid-1930s. I saw that this was going to happen again, except this time it was going to be even worse. Why? Because the aggregate levels of debt were even far higher, exponentially higher than in the 1930s. Now it wasn't just going to be confined to the United States, it was going to be a global phenomenon. There were bubbles all over the world. All right? We may have been the chief domino, but we were only one of a number of dominoes. Japan had already experienced a collapse in 1990 when its Nikkei collapsed, falling from huge valuations, losing 80% of its value, dropping into another basic deflationary collapse in demand that started in 1992, and they haven't come out of it since. The only way Japan has stayed alive and its economy functioning since 1992 was that in the early stages of the collapse, its economy was buoyed up by the credit bubble in the United States, where the Japanese sold the United States cars, electronics, and exported huge amounts of consumer goods to a consumer bubble in the United States fed by cheap Fed rates. This kept Japan's economy functioning after the huge blow of the collapse of its Nikkei. It couldn't do it alone. The collapse was so massive that Japan started borrowing money. It needed to borrow money, and now Japan's national debt is 225% higher than its GDP. The largest debt per GDP ratio of all industrialized countries. I saw that this was going to happen, or at least I felt it was going to happen in the United States too. And so when I gave my paper to the Positive Demon Network, this is what I predicted. Real estate was going to fall 40 to 70%. Stock markets would drop 70 to 90%. Gold would double, triple, even quadruple. At the time, gold was $625 an ounce. What happened then at the PDN, it was disbelief. One person in that group of approximately 60, I found out later, already had his assets in gold and silver. Most of my fellow members of the Positive Deviant Network had their assets in real estate. It had achieved the greatest gains in the last few years, and they were riding the pony, for all it was worth. I delivered the paper in March, and in May I started writing articles. In May I wrote one article where I predicted that summer subprime loans would start defaulting and bring down the economy around the world. I wrote those words in May 2007. In the first week of July, 2 Bear Stearns hedge funds, each worth $1 billion, collapsed in a matter of days, as I had predicted 2 months before. In September, a credit contraction moved around the world unexpectedly. A contraction that was 1 year later going to bring down Wall Street itself, Lehman Brothers, AIG, Bear Stearns. And were it not for the massive infusion of taxpayer aid to Wall Street, more banks would have fallen. And you would have had a run on banks you hadn't seen since the 1930s. So the paper I had predicted, that I had written in 2006 and finished in December, it's now 7 years later. This is December 2013. And that's why the title of my talk today, the topic is The End of the Beginning. The 7 years since I finished my 148-page report was what I consider the beginning of this phase of of the collapse. In truth, it had been triggered 7 years earlier than that, when the dot-com bubble had wobbled and exploded in New York in March 2000. Approximately, almost exactly 7 years later, I was writing my report. That was the first destabilizing collapse of a bubble. The 2000 collapse and 7 collapse of the real estate bubble was the second destabilizing bubble. And now, the 7 years between December 2006 and today, December 2013, is what I call the end of the beginning. The beginning was 7 years that comprised the distance and the time between when I finished my report and when I'm talking to you today. Some of you who watch these videos started early on listening to me in 2007 when I began writing those articles. I got an email from Leo McCarthy. We had met in Europe. I was giving a talk on Austrian economics. And he sort of followed. He just emailed me a couple months ago and says he's still staying in touch with what I'm writing, etc., etc. And he knows what I said then, and he knows what I'm saying now. Some of you just came along. I just started doing these videos. I started writing in 2007. And I only started these dollars and cents videos in 2009. And some of you are much later to the party and don't know how I got into this or where I was before when you've happened across these videos. So that's some background. So as we are here today, in 2013, as the year ends, this is the end of the beginning. Now, what has happened in those ensuing 7 years when I first started predicting the collapse of the U.S. and global economy? Well, the collapse began. It isn't over. Real estate did fall 40 to 70%, just as I predicted. Gold doubled, then tripled, and it was on its way to quadrupling before the central banks moved in strongly in September 2012, when gold had risen 27% in 2 months, and they slashed interest rates on gold leasing to flood the markets and drops gold's ascent. And they've been at it ever since. In truth, and this is what I wrote in my paper that I presented to the Positive Deviant Network, that the Fed and the Western central banks have been managing gold since the mid-1980s. And they still are today. Stocks, however, have regained their luster. I just read last week that until they started dropping this week, they had reached highs again. Nominal highs, not real highs. Given for inflation, they haven't not yet reached where they were in the year 2000. Nonetheless, they haven't dropped the 70 to 90% that I predicted in my paper in 2006, 2007. Trust me, they will. Had it not been for the Fed's massive money printing, for the Fed slashing interest rates down to 0.25%, basically zero, making credit basically free, money free, and that money didn't flow into the economy. Jobs never recovered. What it did do, though, that money flowed just like the cheap money did when Greenspan did it in 2002, 2006. That money flowed into the real estate market and created a real estate bubble which collapsed in 2007 and brought down the global economy. Bernanke's cheap money, even cheaper than Greenspan's 1.25%. Never before has the United States ever had money this cheap for this long. That money didn't flow into the real estate market. The real estate market is barely moribund. And the only reason it's still functioning is the United States government is basically the buyer of last resort. The only provider of liquidity for the buying and selling of homes in the United States. And if the United States government wasn't buying up those bonds, there'd be no one to finance the sale of your house or the purchase of another one. Were it not for the Fed's free money printing, massive, now into the trillions, stock markets would not be where they are today. The stock markets are high, not because they reflect real demand, not because the economy has recovered once again, not because the bankers' Ponzi scheme of credit and debt is now stable and growing like it did before. No. The economy of the world is on central bank life support. The Central Bank of the United States, its balance sheet in 2008, 2007 was under $1 trillion. And it was basically in short-term securities. Now it's swollen to over $4 trillion, filled with U.S. debt and mortgages that they can't sell because no one will buy them at the prices they need to liquidate them at. So now, rather than declare the losses, because if they mark to market, the Fed would be bankrupt. So rather than declare the losses, they're intending to hold them to maturation. I want to say the maturation will not be what the Fed expects. The 7 years that have transpired since December 2006, we have seen Milton Friedman's patent medicine solution to the Great Depression put to the test. When Ben Bernanke said that he was a student of the Great Depression, he was. Unfortunately, his mentor was Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman was brilliant. I'll give him that much. He was as brilliant as John Maynard Keynes. They were both brilliant. And all the sarcasm that the internet heaps on Keynes, and they try and don't talk about Milty that much. Milton deserves just as much as Keynes does. The difference was Keynes was a liberal, Friedman was a conservative. And so the arguments or the support of each have less to do with economic fundamentals and truth than it has with ideological bickering. Krugman on the left supports Keynes, as do the liberals. The conservatives on the right support Friedman because they're conservatives, as was he. Free markets. In truth, both were grossly wrong. Both believed that we didn't need gold, that we could function without them. I want to tell you, we can't. We are here now at the end of the beginning. That the 7 years since I first finished my book, where I predicted an severe economic collapse on the level of the Great Depression, it's been 7 years. 7 years is a long time. And I'd like to say that in my book, that means we're 7 years closer to the resolution of this economic crisis. we are only through the first phase. We are only through the beginning of the collapse. The central bankers learned a lot from the first collapse in the 1930s. They realized if you let the markets take their course in the aftermath of a severe speculative bubble bursting, such as happened in 1929, your banks would go to dust. People would get scared, run to the banks, withdraw their savings, find they're not there, and the banks would have to collapse. By 1932, I think 80% of the banks in the United States had already collapsed, and the rest were about to when Franklin Delano Roosevelt declared a bank holiday. In other words, saying the banks are going to close until they can reopen on a stronger footing. And when they did reopen eventually, the United States had created something like the FDIC, where they gave the banks the right to put a sticker in their window saying that your savings are insured by the United States government up to $5,000. And for that, putting that little sticker on their window, the banks paid nominal amount of money insurance. Nowhere able to cover another bank run. But it worked. It kept Americans now thinking that the banks were somehow safer. They didn't understand why, and they didn't understand that it was their money that the United States government was going to pay out, not the bank's money, in case of another bank run. Now, Milton Friedman, he's considered, that he had studied the Great Depression, and he certainly did. But Milton Friedman had come to the wrong conclusions, just like he did about gold. He was the one basically behind Nixon's, there was a number of factors that caused Nixon to shut the gold window in 1971. One, the United States had spent almost all of its gold, and in fact overspent all of its gold between 1949 and 1971 on its U.S. Military presence all around the world, and the expansion of the corporate empire that was backed by the Import-Export Bank, funded by U.S. taxpayers, that started first sending U.S. jobs overseas. But nonetheless, what Friedman had thought was, well, if you take gold away from money, then the free markets will determine the value of currencies. Free markets are very quick. Speculators, they're very smart, and they're going to know when you have negative trade balances, and they're going to adjust, and pretty soon they're going to have to bring it back into balance. And the markets are going to keep everything stable. That was the theory then, that free markets are the panacea to the ups and downs of economic vagaries. Well, what happened is when they pulled gold out, which is an artificial pegging, as it were, from money, the United States became the largest debtor in the world. And instead of its dollar going down in value, the dollar stayed stable for decades. Now, where did Milton Friedman's theory go? Well, for people like me who were smoking pot at the time, it went up in smoke. And for the rest of you who weren't smoking pot, you just ignored it. You wanted to believe the free markets were going to save your economy. These markets have never been free. Compared to the communist heavy hands of allocated distribution and demand, they were free. But what distinguished capitalism's markets weren't that they were free. What really distinguished capitalism's markets was that the entry point was a dollar-based coupon that issued from a central bank in the form of debt. What the bankers had done, they had distorted supply and demand dynamics with credit and debt. Now, when economists focus their attention on markets, they're not even looking at supply and demand except as background causalities, background factors. The predominant factor driving markets is not supply and demand, which is the driver of free markets. The driver of today's markets is central bank credit. These are manipulated markets. These are not free markets. But for those of you who have gotten drunk on the bankers' promises of great wealth while they robbed you and your nations blind, it sufficed, but it will no longer. We are at the end of capitalism's, the bankers' 300-year scheme of credit and debt. We're at the end of their wet dream of world dominion. We are at the end of the enslavement of the human race. Now, why would I say something like that? And when I talk with people, and they go, Darryl, bankers are more powerful than ever. They own governments. All right? They own governments. And governments are more powerful than ever. And so they are. Bankers are more powerful than ever. Governments are more powerful than ever. And people go, this is going to continue. Well, that's what governments and bankers hope. That's what governments and bankers think. And that's what governments and bankers wish. And that's what many of you fear. I, for one, don't believe it. I have always said a better world is coming, and I want to explain to you why. When I wrote my paper in 2006, 2007, predicting the collapse of the global economy, United States economy, based upon fundamentals, blah, 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 which are as true today as they were then, I ended every article that I wrote since then with the words, buy gold, buy silver, have faith. And the buying of precious metals, for those who had liquid assets, I believe was the only thing, the only vehicle that was going to get you from here to there. The equity markets, when growth goes to zilch, will not provide you any profits. They have so far, but they've not been buoyed by real economic growth. They've been buoyed up by central bank liquidity. The fear of Fed tapering is what keeps bankers and investors scared shitless these days. And what really keeps bankers afraid, central bankers afraid, is deflation. And I wrote in my book that deflation is the elephant in the room, that central bankers don't want to talk about that. And I made that assertion in 2006, 2007, and 13 years later, it is more true than ever. Rather than call it deflation, they call it low inflation. What does that mean? That means a lack of demand. A lack of demand means prices going down. That means oversupply. That means that the Ponzi scheme of the bankers has gone negative. Gone negative. This is what happened during the 1930s. It is what is happening today. It has been delayed. It has been extended. It has not been stopped. Buckminster Fuller, who I've talked about in a lot of these programs, was an extraordinary person. He understood not only the world as it appeared to be, he understood it as the world as it truly was. And I mean that in a metaphysical sense. Bucky said his life changed at the age of 27 when, after encountering a series of financial disasters, he decided he was going to commit suicide. And so as he was thinking about throwing himself into the water, the next thing he knew, he was suspended 10 feet in the air, surrounded by light. And he heard these words, "This is not your life to end. And if you dedicate the rest of your life towards helping humanity, I will take care of you." Well, my friend Marshall Thurber, who started the Positive Dreaming Network, was a very close friend of Bucky. And that's why I know what I do know about Buckminster Fuller. Very few people know those stories. Marshall knew Bucky intimately. And besides, the mainstream media didn't like telling stories like that. Sort of made him nervous. Marshall said he was stunned by Buckminster Fuller. His faith in those words was so great that every month, Marshall said Bucky would write his checkbook down to zero and give that money away. Because he said this was part of the promise that the universe had made to him. That if he helped humanity, the universe would take care of him. And Bucky did help humanity, and the universe did take care of him. What most people don't know about Bucky was his understanding of economics and politics. Bucky said in his book, The Critical Path, that he tried to make sure that his predictions were 50 years out or more, because he didn't want to threaten the existing power structure. In his book, The Critical Path, which was published the year before he died, 1981, Buckminster Fuller said that mankind is entering a period of unprecedented crisis. A crisis that is going to transform humanity. I'd like to read you something else that Bucky said in another book he wrote later. It was published posthumously, called The Grunch of Giants. Humanity is now experiencing history's most difficult evolutionary transformation. Cosmography, a posthumous scenario for the future of humanity. Dear reader, traditional human power structures and their reign of darkness are about to be rendered obsolete. This is what Bucky Fuller wrote. It was published posthumously. Traditional human power structures and their reign of darkness are about to be rendered obsolete. The introduction to the Critical Path was titled The Twilight of the World's Power Structures. 10 years after he wrote that book, 9 years after his death, the Soviet Union collapsed. And 30 years later, capitalism is collapsing. Bucky didn't say communism was going to collapse. He said the world's power structures were going to collapse, including the United States. Bucky called Class 1 evolutionary events, he said they're transcendental to any human vision. Planning, manipulation, and corruption. Class 1 evolutionary events are set in motion by the universe. The same force that told Bucky his life was not his to throw away. And what Bucky said was this: the Class 1 evolution is about to put the USA out of business through international bankruptcy. This will be a powerful example of Class 1 evolution at work. The bankruptcy need not be the end. It is simply nature's way of ridding the planet of the most powerful of yesterday's sovereignties, thereby setting off a chain of 149 desovereignizations, altogether removing the most stubborn barrier to the free circulation of the earth's metals, foods, and income energy supplies. Bucky said that the world's governments are the greatest impediment to life on this earth being the abundant, peaceful way that it should be. And he predicted in his book, The Critical Path, that we were about to enter a crisis of unprecedented proportions that was about to transform humanity. This, I want to say, is the period that we are in 2013. This is merely the end of the beginning. The crisis has started. It's moved 7 years since I warned about it in my paper to the Positive Deviant Network. I don't like to make a lot of predictions because there's so many chances they're going to be wrong. But I do believe certain things are going to happen, like I believed were going to happen when I wrote my paper. This is December 2013. In another 7 years, the world as we know it is going to be so radically different. If you are here at that time, your remembrance of the world that we believe is going to extend in the future, that thought is going to end up at the bottom of the ocean. We're about to see the next phase of the collapse. Markets, fed only by central bank liquidity, have managed to stay afloat for the past few years. But like steroids, over time, their effect is no longer helpful, but harmful. Central bank liquidity has had a steroid-like effect on world markets. After the 2008 collapse, Western industrialized countries were so caught up with the collapse in demand, they never recovered. The cheap money has merely kept them from sinking. That money flowed out of the West into the emerging markets, China, India, Russia, and Brazil, the BRIC nations. And they became the drivers of economic growth. And now, they too are faltering. With the emerging nations joining the heavily indebted industrialized nations in a moribund state of deflationary collapse in demand, there's no one else. The attempt to artificially substitute public demand based on government borrowing and spending has been beneficial up to this point, in the same way that the use of steroids is beneficial up to a point. Once that point is reached, money printing, QE, quantitative easing as they call it, whatever, monetization of debt, buying of bonds, while perhaps helpful in the past, will turn and become dangerous. Just as dangerous as the overuse of steroids ultimately becomes. In the beginning, steroid use helps the patient. In the end, that same usage kills them. The talk of tapering is illusory. The central banks are no more capable of stopping their incessant money printing than alcoholics are of ending their drink. And even more so, because they're doing it volitionally. Alcoholics no longer have the ability to overcome their addiction. Central bankers can turn off that spigot like that. But they know if they did, the economies would collapse beneath them, along with the huge edifice of debt that still overhangs the markets, and we will see the end of the world as we know it. And as much as that may strike fear into your hearts, I want to tell you that, as Bucky said, it's a cause for joy and anticipation. Humanity, as I know it to be, is content to eke out a living as debt slaves to the masters and the elites that control the world, their armies, their banks, their pension funds, Wall Street, the city, international bourses. And the debt slaves that toil, hoping to eke out an existence in a world that they did not create, in a world in which they can barely survive. Well, that world is going to end, not because the slaves are going to revolt, because they can't. They're too indebted. They are too dispirited. They are too afraid of the consequences. That world of debt slavery is going to end because the masters of debt, the merchants of debt, are going to be trampled by that which they have set in motion. The beginning of this collapse is already over. The 7 years that have expired since I made my prediction about a global economic collapse have brought us 7 years closer to the resolution of what I predicted in 2006, 2007. We are now in 2013, about to enter 2014. And I predict in 2021, this will be ancient history. The rubble will be so deep that the world that that you once remembered and believed that would last ad infinitum will lay totally destroyed. But out of that destruction, as Bucky Fuller said, will come the emancipation of humanity. There was another book that was written in 1996. It was called The Fourth Turning. 1996, this is what this book said. The fourth turning is due to begin shortly after the new millennium, 2000. Around the year 2005, a sudden spark will catalyze the crisis mood. Remnants of the old social order will disintegrate. Political and economic trust will implode. Real hardship will beset the land. The very survival of the nation will feel at stake. The risk of catastrophe will be very high. The nation could erupt into an insurrection or civil violence, crack up geographically, or succumb to authoritarian rule. If there is a war, it will likely be one of maximum risk and effort. In other words, a total war. A new world is coming. A better world is going to succeed the world that you find familiar and even secure. But when it passes, you will find that your handcuffs and chains will no longer be there. By gold.